wonderful time. I really want to thank Yifa again for putting this together. It kind of stems from something that Jeffrey started as well too, with Nicole, this transformative technologies part. And so I know there's been a lot of debate and discussion over Buddhism and technology and practices, and it can kind of get confusing. And so I'm going to try to bring some clarity and really look at it and look at what we can really talk about from a scientific perspective. Because we're looking at the ultimate goal. I think this is a term that Jeff Lieberman came up with, which is engineering enlightenment. You know, can we know so well about the body and about nature that we can engineer enlightenment? Which, if Siddhartha was born around this time, that's what he would be working on. So let's just go into this. I look at consciousness from my background's in electrical engineering and computer science. And I know I'm going to come from a very reductionist approach because I am trying to build a science or look at building a science in this space. So I look at the relationship between the mind and the body, kind of like hardware and software in a computer. So physically we're here, our bodies are all here. Like for example, people that aren't here right now that have never heard my talk right now, have never heard my talk before, probably aren't going to be aware of what we're talking about. But those of you that are here that can understand what I'm saying, you just told me not know what I'm talking about, but may, because physically we're here. And in this conversation, in this talk, we seem to be somewhere as well. So what I like to usually throw at people is that physically we're here, but where is this conversation happening? Where is this? Well, there's a phone ringing. Can you hear the phone ring? And so our bodies are in the air, but where is this conversation happening? And what I mean by that, if I say Beijing, and you know what I mean, are there certain neurons in my brain that are wired like yours? What's the relationship between this mental space and the physical body? In relation to that, if I point at this bottle, if I point at this, what do you see? A bottle, right? So you see this bottle because you have an experience and you call it a bottle. But if I mention that statue that France gave to the United States that's outside of New York Harbor, the Statue of Liberty, right? And so I'm pointing at something in space and time. When I mention the statue that France gave to the United States, I'm also pointing at something in this mental space. And you are able to see it just as I was able to point at this. And so we're really interested in what is that relationship. Now, from a hardcore epistemological perspective, if you look at physiology as hardware and phenomenology as software, and if you look at what's influencing you right now, what is there influencing you right now? So all there is to everything in the universe right now is what's physically around us, literally this auditorium. There's how your body feels, whether you're hungry, thirsty, or have to go to the bathroom, or you're tired. And there's what you know from thought. And everything in the universe is in one of those three categories. So for example, do these flowers exist? Yeah? How do we know they exist? You can see it, smell it, right? Now, does Beijing exist right now? No, well, it may exist, but our knowledge of it is from thought. So everything that's influencing the physiology is what's physically around us. There's how your body feels, whether you're hungry or thirsty, and what you know from thought. And that's everything in the universe right now. Yeah? And so if we look at this way, in this way, what thought does and what this discussion is in the realm of thought. And if you look at it from the perspective of, kind of breaking it down, thought in your thinking is kind of like the controller. It's like the CPU. It's the algorithm that's running your experience. So you have sensors. I noticed more people are showing up. William just showed up. So you have these sensors. And then based upon this, you're processing this. And then you're engaging the world. Right? And so there's a lot of talk on AI. And the top AI, without any motor capability, is going to look something like this, arguably. Yeah? So here, you've got Stephen Hawking. He can compute a lot, and he has a lot of deep insights. But without the ability to move, it's kind of stuck in that head of his. Yeah? And so the thing that's happening in this conversation is it's all happening here, which is basically adjusting the controller of the robotic unit that you are, arguably. Yeah? All right? And so, where did this controller develop? Where did these beliefs and thoughts come from? When you were born, there were no beliefs. There were no ideas. There were no concepts, arguably. Yeah? But there were things that were around you, and you were a body. And then what happened was, sometime you realized, hey, there's a me, and I'm separate from this. And the environment acts on me. And then from that, I develop an idea. And so initially when you were born, there were just sensations. You had no motor action. Just think of a baby. And then what happens, after a while, certain sensations correlate. Oh, that's wee-wee, that's poo-poo, a breast, milk, mother, father. And you build a symbolic consciousness. And as you engage the world and the surroundings engage you, you expand your worldview and your belief system. Yeah? But the thing is, all of this happens from experience. And what that does, and so our question is, what happens? How do we go from something like this, who's pretty young, innocent, and everything, and has no worldview, to something like this, that if you don't put the toilet seat down after you go to the bathroom, you are going to get yelled at. Right? So what happened? And how did this become this? And so it's this process of expanding the worldview, and the worldview then binds. So symbols and relationships in the mind, in the controller, bind to emotions and processes in physiology. So experience binds the symbols in thought to the processes of physiology. From your perspective, me, right now, I'm just a semantic token. I'm just some symbol that's showing up in your field of awareness. Right? Those of you that have never seen me before, you're seeing me for the first time. We're just meeting right now. I'm just a symbol showing up in your field of awareness. And I make you feel a certain way based upon all of your past experiences. Then, oh, he's Chinese American, he only speaks English or doesn't speak Chinese very well, etc. All of these past experiences bind onto me. And so I become a symbol that makes you feel a certain way in the physiological process. Now the neat thing is, whether it's me as a person, or whether it's a character in a movie, or it's a character in a video game, it's the same thing. It's some symbol that has some meaning to you that regulates your affect, regulates your emotions. That's all it does, looking at it from a physiological perspective. And so the thing about this is, if you understand the development of the brain, thinking, in your experience of the moment through the senses, uses the same underlying hardware. It uses the same endocrine system, it uses the same autonomic nervous system, but the issue is your awareness doesn't know the difference. It doesn't know the difference between the stimuli, which is coming from thought, versus the stimuli, which is coming from, literally, what's physically around you. And so right now, if you look at what's happening here in this talk, I'm speaking, you guys are in the audience, all of your bodies are there, I'm talking, you hear what I'm saying, and then your understanding of what I'm saying is based upon all of your past experiences that are encoded in your physiology. So this conversation is just my physiology. I'm holding a certain state in my physiology. You're listening, and you're processing the words, which are evoking sensations in your physiology. Some of you might disagree violently with what I'm saying, Others may be in agreement, other people may be confused, but that relates to the symbols and the words that I'm saying and how that makes your body feel. Right? So this is all that's going on right now. I'm not explaining it, I'm just trying to explain, frame, and model what's going on right now in this communication. And so the main thing about this is that language communication is actually a process of physiological resonance. So it's a relationship between my body, the ideas and experiences that I have encoded in my physiology, and the experiences that you have encoded in your physiology. And so it's a body-to-body thing. So I can tell, like Yifa, she's listening, but she's also doing her phone. So, you know, what I'm... Okay, taking notes. Normally she's sending pictures to people and on WeChat, etc. Sat next to her last time. And so the whole thing about it is it's a physiological resonance. Okay, and so when I said that, it triggered her, and so she had to respond. And so this is what's going on in this for communication. So it's embodied. Now typically what happens is the physiology tries to maintain homeostasis. So the physiology tries to maintain regulation, which reinforces a mental worldview, which then motivates action. I do something, that then influences the physiology, which reinforces my mental worldview, which motivates action. So that's a person's conditioned behavior pattern. And it's programmed in from childhood. And so if you think of early child developmental psychology, all of these patterns from the physiological perspective, it's trying to maintain homeostasis. It's trying to just do what seems normal. But, you know, when my mother yells at me, it's very much like my mom, by the way. So, when they yell at you, etc., things feel familiar. And what your physiology does is it tries to maintain these patterns that feels familiar. And so part of transformation is uncoupling the influences of the symbols on the processes of physiology. Jumping ahead. And what happens for the physiology, generally speaking, is it always tries to move to higher energy states. That peak performance state that we've talked a little bit about, whether you're an Olympic athlete, a stock trader, or a jazz musician, it's a situation, it's a context that kicks you into this state where you're very present, like whether surfing, driving a fast car, jumping out of airplanes, etc. And it kicks you, it's the context. Usually if you're jumping out of an airplane or rock climbing, it's you know that one little mistake, and you're going to die. And so that kicks the energy up, and then you're very present, and you can't really think. You think about jazz musicians, Olympic athletes, they have to think, they're dead. And so what happens is the worldview, your belief system, regulates the physiology. And the only real difference between people is that they're just at different stages of development. And so Carol already kind of mapped out the different stages, and as you shift through different stages, your worldview, what's important, how you process, develops. So the psyche develops along with the physiology, and that kicks the energy up, and it gives you greater capacity, greater endurance, etc. And so what happens is, when we're born, we have a physical body, we develop awareness, object permanence, symbolic consciousness, and then we shift through different worldviews, and then it's almost like one of these bells. You hit it, you know, this thing goes up, you either hit the bell or not, and if you don't make it to the top, you come back down. And then the Tibetan Book of the Dead kind of talks about that process. And then, you know, from a Buddhist perspective, you just kind of go around until you hit the bell, arguably. And so the transformative experience, there's a process. So if you look at John Marshall Roberts' talk, he talks about a process that happens through the development. So A is you have an experience, you push beyond your normal known, you go into the unknown, you develop the experience, and then you return. And so you can do it by traditional practices, psychoactive substances, trans tech, and things just happen. A lot of people have crises, you know, through divorce, parents dying, change of job, etc. And then there's an integration, which is about cultivating greater somatic awareness with new energy, understanding how to integrate that into the body and applying it. So that's generally the process. But what happens for some people is the physiology tries to maintain a homeostasis, which reinforces a worldview, which motivates action. And at times, through crises, the energy kicks really high, let's say my parents die, my girlfriend leaves me, my wife divorces me, and I lose my job at the same time, I'm no longer able to maintain this. I go into fear, I go into a very high energy state. And then what happens generally in higher energy states is surreal shit starts happening. So coincidences, synchronicities, a lot of other things start happening. And the thing is that if I can't maintain that, if I can't turn off the story-making part of the brain, I'm going to crash. Because the stories are going to kick the energy even higher, the physiology is no longer able to sustain that energy, and then they crash. And so it's kind of like a rocket metaphor, where thoughts are kind of the scaffolding to kick the energy system up in the physiology. But once you get a realization that there are bigger forces at work, or that you can surrender, you have to let them go and start using a different source of energy. And what I mean by a different source of energy is thoughts, while you're tied to beliefs, all thoughts really do is just regulate the energy in your physiology. If something good, you feel really great. Something bad happens, you feel down. Physically, though, in the environment, everything is still the same. It's just how you're framing the world. And so, I'm really short on time, but the idea here is to decouple the influences of thought on the processes of physiology. And so can you let go of all stories and the influences of the stories and the symbols on the physiology? Now the problem is to do this, it's terrifying, right? Letting go of the influences of all the symbols means letting go of all meaning. And so this is me and my daughter. We just had the daddy-daughter ball. This was taken last week. And for me, there's part of me with a daughter like this. I like to hold on to every moment with my daughter. And even this, this conference, I'd love, this is probably the last time the collection of all of us will get together, ever. Right? And part of you may want to hold on to this, but you can't. Right? And so, letting go of the influences of all symbols, if you understand its mechanisms in the physiology, is effectively psychological suicide. Because these symbols use the same processes to decouple their influences is effectively psychological suicide. And the ego, and we were talking about the ego a bit, there were some questions yesterday, is not going to let that happen. Because it'll trigger fear, it'll use all of its mechanisms at its disposal, which is literally every physiological process. And you have to decouple from that completely. And when you do, and the energy source that you have to switch to is, rather than regulating the physiology from the stories, is that underneath all the stories, underneath all of the stories, is an inner experience that's present within everybody. And the only way I can describe that experience with words is that right here and right now, it's good to be alive. So if you can feel that, joy, wonder, gratitude, compassion comes from that. And if you really feel into it, compared to being dead right now, this is amazing. Right? And so there's a vast reservoir of energy there that you don't have to do anything for. You just have to realize that you're alive and you exist. You have a ticket to the show. Okay? And if you look at babies, and so what is it that's creating the stress and anxiety? Arguably, it's the processes influenced by thought and framing. And so, in the enlightened states, to decouple the influences, and once you're able to do that, all that's left then is literally this room and its influence in the physiology, and the person walking by and the other. This is all there is. And then if you start looking at that and using your past experiences that got you here, almost as a wind chime. So as things come up, new thoughts and ideas will come. Right? And so this is how you start accessing intuition, insight, and seeing. And if you're aware of everything that's happening around, it's being able to see the thing. You use the Plato's cave allegory. And so it's a way of seeing, by stilling the mind, to see the trajectory. And so there's a difference, and this is the challenge now, there's a difference between knowing something conceptually and knowing something experientially. Intellectual knowing is 1 + 1 = 2. Experiential knowing is knowing that you have to go to the bathroom, right? So a conceptual knowing is, I'm running out of time. And it's kind of an experiential knowing right now too, although no one's really pulled me off the stage yet. And so we're largely driven, but the whole point behind this is they use the same physiological mechanisms, but the way that they're processed and the way that you live from them is very different. And from a phenomenological research perspective, we look at the difference between accessing neurologically and intellectual knowing versus an experiential. Now the neat thing about this related to media is that when you read books and everything, it's a conceptual knowing. But when you play games and you're involved in experiences, it's an experiential knowing, which is very different. And the neural pathways and the way that you process is completely different. And so what happens, generally, is we have different systems of thought that we develop through. That becomes usually what happens is people go through a high energy state, and then there's a dark night of the soul as well. So there's and that dark night of the soul is decoupling the influences of the process, the symbols on the processes of physiology, which is deep depression. Deep depression, in my perspective, is a really good thing. What's happened well, there are different forms of depression, but generally, if you have no reason for living, and nothing draws you, that's a really good thing. Deep depression, connected to the innate joy of being, is, I think it's where it's at. And then as you do that then, how you use the whole system. So it's almost like a crank. Thoughts crank up the system. Once it hits a threshold and you can trust in the universe, understand that there are bigger forces at work, and surrender to them completely, then it becomes an inquiry. And you move from a robot-based approach, where you're continuing to build and refine the controller, to a radio, where more people are coming in, things are happening, and you're just feeling it, and you're exploring it. And if the force motivating the action is the innate joy of being, living life is kind of like dancing. Now, for me, it's been quite an adventure. This picture was taken January 30th, 2000, and that was the first time I met Yifa. I flew all the way to Shanghai. She was going on her way to Antarctica, and we had a meeting with my friend Wendy as well too. Originally, this conference was going to be in Beijing, and then I was able to convince her to move it to Shanghai, and a lot of things happened. It's been quite a journey from January 30th till today. But it's been an interesting ride. It's been a fun ride. And although there have been trials and tribulations and things, here we are. Here we are. And I still love you. And for me and her, related to this, is what we do typically, the way I like to test this, is we ask the universe questions. And so right now I have 3 questions with Yifa. Future versions of this conference and gatherings, right? I'm going to introduce her. I'm going to try to introduce her to the Robert Koch Foundation. Now it's recording. And then we're going to try to get this house by Yale funded, right? That's something we've talked about. And Woodenfish Village. Those are the 3 things that we have. Other than that, we're pretty much clear. Yeah? Yeah? And so with different people, for me, it's you just ask different questions to the universe and see how the universe responds. And then you just explore. You know, for me, I'm very grateful. Each one of you are here. 14.7 billion years of evolution have brought us to this moment. If one little particle moved away, etc., none of this would be as it is today. And so, you know, in terms of it, you have, especially with a lot of high-level people, you know, it's kind of like Kobe and Shaq, right? When they work together, it's beautiful. When they don't, well, you know what happened there. So how do we develop processes to shift people along from a doing more towards a being, right? And that's just learning to listen and learning how to dance. Now the exciting thing here in the problems is that when early in days, and this is the religious differences, Your reality 5,000 years ago was dictated by where you lived and what the stories were. 2,500 years ago, there was a split. Culture and religion went one way, and science went the other way. And we developed languages for this, and we developed different languages for this. Now the opportunity, and if you look at where media, the influences of media, is early days, media was used to tell you who are you, why are you here, and what is this? And through from art to traditional media to mass media, and now interactive media that can sense, provide a situation, sense how you respond, and know your psyche based upon how you respond is very powerful. And then that, combined with what we know about neuroscience and physiology, brings a reconvergence of the development process and the stories and the science of what's going on in the physiology, which is objectively measured. We can have completely different worldviews, but the underlying physiological processes are similar. And so that's where looking at third person and looking at interactive media and technology can greatly, if we can then somehow create experiences that bring people through this process and scale it just like the internet technology. And if we can do this on a global scale, by definition, world peace. If everyone in the world can act from the innate joy of being, rather than the fear, need, and desire that are driven by stories, world peace. That's the premise. And the last thing I'd like to share with you, and the fun thing about this, is that no matter where you go, and no matter what you do, you have to understand it's the controller that you're playing with. Because wherever you go, after this conference, etc., it's wherever you go, it's literally, it's going to be what your thoughts are, how your body feels, and what's physically around you. You can't leave that. Right? And so what are the stories and the algorithms, and how are you living your life? Thank you. Wait. Hold on. Let me just have to do this to him because he does this to me all. Can I get my slides back real quick? So the practical application of this is that thoughts in your experience of the moment through the senses uses the same underlying hardware. Knowing this, there are Buddhist practices and everything, in terms of the right action and all of this other stuff, is controller regulation. So Jeffrey has spent a good chunk of his life, and he's found 4 teachers. Okay, 24 practices now. It started as 4. Started as 8, now it's 24. And basically, understanding this, if you look at the practices in detail, what they do is they help you bring your awareness more into here and out of the stories. Because we know that thinking in your experience of the moment through the senses uses the same hardware. And if there's no trigger, if there are less thoughts and everything, and there are no triggers for the autonomic nervous system, there's no fear, anxiety, and anger. And so it's understanding the physiological mechanisms. And what he's created is a way of providing a clutch for people. Initially a clutch to just disengage the mind or occupy the mind in another way. So I know when my kids, if you've ever driven in a car with kids, when they start getting naughty, when they're a baby, I just play with the light, and then they'd be happy again. And so it's really how do you change attention, which is a large part of what Buddhist practice is about. All right, next up we have Jeffrey Martin, who's going to talk about these further stages in his work in the Finders program.